Hello, and thank you for being here with me today. My name is Dr. Rebecca Finley. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, to my family of corporate raiders, I was simply the gardener. They saw my life's work, my passion for creating vibrant public gardens, as a quaint, slightly embarrassing hobby, a charity case unworthy of the Finley name. They thought my power began and ended at the edge of a flower bed. They never imagined that my little gardening projects were about to derail the biggest, most ruthless deal of my father's career. What would you do if the very thing your family mocked you for became the source of your greatest power? Before I reveal exactly how I turned a boardroom into a battleground and showed my father what it truly means to build something that lasts, I'd love to know where you're all watching from today. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever felt underestimated by the people who should have believed in you the most, go ahead and hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers, please subscribe to join our community of storytellers who understand that sometimes the quietest people have the most powerful stories to tell. The scent of roasted rosemary and my mother's expensive perfume always blended into a single suffocating aroma that, for me, was the official fragrance of Sunday dinner. It was the smell of obligation. I sat at the polished mahogany table, a dark, reflective sea that had mirrored countless tense family meals, and tried to make myself small. It was a skill I had perfected over 3 decades. My father, Arthur Finley, sat at the head of the table, a king on a throne of his own making. His presence filled the room, not with warmth, but with a kind of high-pressure system that made everyone else feel like they were breathing thinner air. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his custom-tailored suit immaculate even on a Sunday. He was talking, as he always did, about the art of the kill. "The key to a successful takeover," he announced, slicing into a piece of lamb with surgical precision, "is to find their weakness and press until it shatters. You don't make friends. You don't build consensus. You conquer." His eyes, a pale, cold blue, scanned the table, landing on my brothers, Grant and Marcus. They were his lieutenants, his acolytes, younger, brasher versions of him. They nodded in perfect sync, their expressions a mixture of reverence and ambition. They looked like predators learning from the pack alpha. "Innovatech is ripe for the picking," Grant added, his voice slick with inherited arrogance. "The founder is an idealist, some tech nerd named Chen. He's running on fumes, practically begging for someone to put him out of his misery." Marcus chimed in, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "He thinks his little green energy patents are going to save the world. We'll save him the trouble and just take the patents. The rest of the company is dead weight. We'll strip it down within a month." I felt a familiar cold knot tighten in my stomach. I knew Innovatech Solutions, or at least I knew their small corporate campus on the edge of town. A year ago, I had designed and installed a community garden on a neglected patch of their land, a project funded by the endowment I worked for. I remembered David Chen, a man with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, who had spoken with such passion about creating not just technology, but a workplace that felt like a community. He had personally helped my team plant the first row of sunflowers. My father finally turned his attention to me, his gaze softening with that particular brand of dismissive pity he reserved for his only daughter. "And how are things in your world, Becca? The Petunias behaving themselves?" Grant snickered. "Don't forget the daisies, Dad. Very high stakes, the world of daisies." I forced a tight, polite smile. "Everything is fine, thank you. We just broke ground on a new therapeutic garden at the Children's Hospital." I said it with a quiet pride that I knew they would misinterpret as naivety. To them, my work was a non-profit novelty, a gentle pastime for a woman who lacked the killer instinct required to be a real Finley. They called me the gardener, with a tone that was half affectionate, half mocking, as if I were a cherished but slightly simple-minded groundskeeper on their sprawling estate of ambition. "That's nice, dear. my mother Eleanor murmured from her end of the table. She was the family's official smoother-over of conflicts, a woman who had long ago traded her own voice for the comfort of her husband's shadow. Her support was a silken pillow, soft and yielding, and ultimately useless in a house built of knives. My father patted my hand, his touch light and condescending. "It's good you have your projects. Keeps you busy." The unspoken words hung in the air between us. "It's good you have your little hobbies, since you'll never understand or participate in the real world of power and consequence." They had no idea. They couldn't possibly comprehend that my little gardening projects were the beautiful public-facing blossoms of an entity with roots so deep and strong they could buckle the very foundations of the empire my father was so proud of. They saw a gardener. They were about to meet the director. They were talking about crushing a small, innovative company for parts, and I was the one person in the world who could stop them. And in that moment, sitting at that suffocating dinner table, I felt a seed of resolve, cold and hard as a winter stone, begin to germinate within me. A resolve I owed not to the Finley name, but to the memory of the woman who had taught me what true strength was. My relationship with Elara Vance had been the defining counterpoint to my life as a Finley. I met her when I was a graduate student, lost and disillusioned, presenting my doctoral thesis on the socio-ecological impact of urban green spaces. My family had attended the presentation, my father looking at his watch every 5 minutes, my brothers openly scrolling on their phones. They had come out of a sense of duty, their presence a show of familial support that felt as hollow as a dead tree. After I finished my presentation to a smattering of polite applause, a woman with eyes as bright and sharp as a hawk's and a cascade of silver hair, pinned up in an elegant twist, approached me. "Dr. Finley," she said, her voice possessed of a low, resonant authority that made me stand a little straighter. That was not merely a presentation. That was a manifesto. She introduced herself as Elara Vance. I knew the name, of course. She was a legend in environmental circles, a semi-reclusive philanthropist who had quietly funded some of the most innovative conservation projects in the world. But in person, she was not some distant, ethereal figure. She was solid, grounded, radiating an intensity that was both intimidating and deeply compelling. She had seen past the academic jargon and the nervous tremor in my voice. She saw the core of my argument, that planting a garden could be a revolutionary act, that creating pockets of life and community in the concrete deserts of our cities wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about resilience, health, and social justice. "Your family doesn't get it, do they?" she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Her gaze flickered over to where my father was clapping my brother Grant on the back, laughing at some shared joke. I didn't have to answer. "They see a balance sheet," Elara continued, her eyes turning back to me, filled with a startling clarity. "They see assets and liabilities. They can't comprehend a return on investment that you can't quantify in a quarterly report. What you and I see is a different kind of wealth, the kind that actually matters." That conversation was the beginning of everything. Elara took me under her wing. She was the founder and sole director of something she called the Gaia Legacy Endowment. To the outside world, and certainly to my family, it was a modest nonprofit. I told my father I'd been offered a job as a project manager, and he'd nodded with that familiar, patronizing air. "Good for you, Becca. A little charity work will look good on you." He imagined a small office with peeling paint and a handful of well-meaning volunteers. He couldn't have been more wrong. Elara's endowment was a behemoth, a multi-billion-dollar fund built from a fortune she had inherited and then brilliantly, quietly multiplied over decades. Her mandate was simple and ferocious, to use that fortune as a shield. a shield to protect a fragile green future from the voracious appetite of men exactly like my father. Our public-facing work, the beautiful gardens I designed and managed, was what she called the honey. It was the sweet, gentle work that drew communities together and masked the hornet's nest of financial power beneath. "Let them think we're just a bunch of old ladies planting roses, Rebecca," she would say with a wry smile, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "The predator never fears the prey until it reveals its teeth." For 10 years, she was my mentor, my champion, and the closest thing I had to a true believer. She taught me more than landscape architecture. We would sit in her vast library, surrounded by books on botany, ecology, finance, and law, and she would school me in her unique philosophy. She taught me how to read a corporate financial statement with the same acuity I read the health of a plant. She taught me that capital could be a tool for cultivation, not just destruction. "Your father and his kind," she once told me, her voice laced with a weary disdain, "are slash-and-burn farmers. They extract value until the soil is barren and then move on, leaving a wasteland behind them. We are gardeners, Rebecca. We invest, we nurture, we build ecosystems that are self-sustaining. It is a slower, quieter, and infinitely more powerful way to shape the world." Her health had been failing for the last few years, a slow, graceful decline she faced with the same unsentimental pragmatism she applied to everything else. She spent that time meticulously preparing me. I thought she was training me to be her successor as a project director. I had no idea she was training me to be her successor as the endowment's sole commander. Elara passed away on a cool autumn morning. Her lawyer, a quiet man named Mr. Harris, summoned me to his office a week later for the reading of her final instructions. I went expecting to hear about the continuation of my projects, perhaps a formal commendation for my work. I did not expect to be handed a single sealed envelope with my name written on it in Elara's elegant, forceful script. Inside was a letter and a set of keys. "My dearest Rebecca," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my time cultivating my own small patch of earth has come to an end. But the work of the Gaia legacy must continue. For a decade, I have watched you. I have tested you. I have seen you stand up to your family's dismissiveness with a quiet grace that belies a spine of steel. You have the heart of a creator, not a conqueror, and that is precisely what the endowment needs. The world has enough conquerors." My hands trembled as I read the next line. "Effective upon my death, I name you, Dr. Rebecca Finley, as the sole director of the Gaia Legacy Endowment, with full and absolute control over its assets, its mission, and its future. The keys are to my private study. Ben Carter, my financial advisor, will be waiting for you there. He will show you everything. Do not be afraid of the power I am giving you, Rebecca. You are not inheriting a weapon. You are inheriting a shield. Use it wisely. Use it bravely. Make them see that the gardener is the most powerful person in the room, for she is the one who knows how to make things grow." I sat there in the sterile silence of the lawyer's office, the letter shaking in my hand, the weight of her trust and the scale of her legacy pressing down on me. I was no longer just a landscape architect. I was the guardian of a multi-billion-dollar environmental fortress, and I had just learned that my father was laying siege to one of the very innovators I was now sworn to protect. The next few days passed in a blur of shock and overwhelming responsibility. I met with Ben Carter, a man with a gentle demeanor, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a mind like a steel trap. He had been Elara's most trusted confidant for 30 years. He led me into her private study, a room I had never been allowed to enter before. It was not the cozy library I was used to. This was a command center. One wall was a bank of monitors displaying market data, news feeds, and complex financial models. The others were lined not with botany books, but with binders containing the intricate details of the endowment's vast and varied holdings. "Ilara wanted you to see this when you were ready," Ben said softly, gesturing to the screens. She called this the root system. The gardens are what the world sees. This is where the real work is done. He walked me through the portfolio. It was staggering. The Gaia Legacy Endowment held significant, often silent stakes in dozens of companies at the cutting edge of renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and water purification. It was a global network of environmental innovation, secretly underwritten by one woman's colossal fortune and fierce will. Ilara's primary directive was to identify and shield keystone species in the corporate ecosystem, Ben explained. Companies whose technology or mission was too important to be devoured by predators. We provide capital, strategic advice, and if necessary, a defensive wall against hostile takeovers. I sank into Ilara's large leather chair, feeling impossibly small. The scent of old books and lemon tea, her signature scent, still lingered in the air. "My father," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He's going after a company called Innovatech Solutions." Ben's expression tightened. He turned to one of the monitors and typed a few commands. A file on Innovatech appeared, complete with real-time stock data and news alerts. "David Chen's company. We've been watching them for months. Their battery storage technology is a game changer, potentially revolutionary." He looked at me, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "And Finley Capital has been circling, driving the stock price down with targeted short selling and a whisper campaign about their financial instability. Classic Arthur Finley." "He called David Chen a fool," I said, the memory of my father's smug pronouncement at dinner making my blood run cold. "He said he was going to strip the company for its patents." Ben nodded grimly. That would be his play. Buy it for pennies on the dollar, fire everyone, sell off the patents to the highest bidder, and dissolve the rest. He'd make a fortune and kill a decade of brilliant research. I looked from the screen showing Innovatech's plummeting stock price to the framed photo of Ilara on the desk. She was smiling, her eyes full of that fierce, intelligent light. In that moment, the grief and shock receded, replaced by a crystalline, cold clarity. This was not an accident. This was a test, the first great test of my new role. My family, the people who had defined me by my perceived weakness, had unwittingly pointed me directly toward my first mission. My father thought he was hunting. He had no idea he was wandering into a protected preserve. "Ben," I said, my voice gaining a strength that surprised even me. "I want to see everything you have on Innovatech, financials, personnel, David Chen's background, and I want a complete analysis of my father's strategy. Every move he's made, and every move you predict he'll make next." I stood up and walked over to the monitors, placing my hand on the cool glass. "Ilara gave me a shield," I said, more to myself than to him. "It's time to see what it can do." The first step was to meet David Chen again, but this time not just as a fellow idealist who liked sunflowers. I needed to understand the man and the company I was considering saving. Ben arranged a meeting under the guise of the endowment exploring a second, larger philanthropic project with Innovatech. We met at their modest headquarters, a place that buzzed with a quiet, focused energy that was the polar opposite of the tense, predatory atmosphere at Finley Capital. David greeted me with a warm, if tired, smile. The strain of the last few months was etched in the lines around his eyes. We sat in his office, which was less of an executive suite and more of a working lab, with whiteboards covered in complex equations and prototypes of battery cells sitting on his shelves. He spoke about his technology not in terms of market value, but in terms of its potential. He envisioned a world where homes could run entirely off-grid, where energy storage was cheap, efficient, and accessible to everyone. His passion was palpable, a bright flame flickering against a gathering storm. "We're so close, Dr. Finley," he said, his hands clasped on his desk. "The science is sound. The prototypes exceed all our expectations. We ran out of runway. We needed one more round of funding to scale up for manufacturing, but word got out that we were vulnerable." He didn't have to say my father's name. It hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Now, the vultures are circling. His gaze dropped to his hands. "I have 150 employees here, good people. They believed in this vision when it was just scribbles on a napkin. I promised them we were building something different, a company with a conscience." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a desperate hope. "This grant you're considering, it would be a godsend, but what we really need is a partner, an investor who sees what we see." I listened, my heart aching for him. He was everything my father despised, brilliant, idealistic, and more concerned with his people than with his profit margin. He was the kind of person Ilara had built the Gaia legacy to protect. I maintained my professional, philanthropic facade, asking questions about his operational needs and 5-year plan, but internally, a decision was cementing. This wasn't just about blocking my father anymore. It was about building David Chen up. "Thank you for your candor, Mr. Chen," I said as we concluded the meeting. "Your work is incredibly impressive. The endowment will be in touch very soon." Walking through the Innovatech lobby, I passed the small community garden I had designed. It was thriving. Employees were sitting on the benches, eating their lunch among the late-blooming marigolds and herbs. It was a tiny oasis of green, a living testament to the kind of world David Chen was trying to build, and the kind of world I was now empowered to defend. The contrast was thrown into sharp relief a few days later. It was my mother's birthday, and she had requested a family brunch at a ridiculously expensive restaurant downtown. It was an exercise in forced civility. The conversation was, as always, dominated by Finley Capital. My father, in high spirits, was holding court. "The Innovatech deal is all but done," he announced, raising a glass of champagne. "The board is weak. The shareholders are terrified. They'll be begging me to take it off their hands by the end of the month. We're offering them 20 cents on the dollar. It's practically a charity." My brother Marcus laughed. "I saw their headquarters. They have a vegetable patch out front. A vegetable patch. Can you imagine? What kind of serious company wastes money on that?" I felt a hot flash of anger. He was mocking my work, my contribution, without even knowing it. He was mocking the very heart of the company he was helping his father destroy. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, forcing my face to remain placid. My silence, my refusal to engage, had always been my shield. Now it was becoming a weapon. They saw my calmness as weakness, as disinterest. They had no idea it was the calm of a strategist watching her opponent move his pieces exactly where she wanted them. My father, feeling expansive and perhaps a little guilty for ignoring me, turned to me with a magnanimous air. "You know, Becca, once we clean up the Innovatech mess, there will be a lot of empty office parkland. We could give you a contract, you could do the landscaping, put in some nice orderly hedges, a real paying job. How would that be?" It was the ultimate insult, wrapped in the guise of a favor. He was offering me the chance to plant decorative shrubs on the grave of a company I respected, a company whose founder's dreams he was about to extinguish. He was offering me a pittance to be the beautician for his butchery. The audacity of it, the sheer blind arrogance took my breath away. For a fleeting second, I wanted to tell him. I wanted to wipe the smug, benevolent smile off his face and tell him that my charity work could buy and sell him 10 times over. I wanted to tell him that while he was planning his conquest, I was planning a rescue. But I held my tongue. Ilara's voice echoed in my mind. The predator never fears the prey until it reveals its teeth. It wasn't time yet, so I gave him a small, enigmatic smile. "Thank you for the offer, Father. I'll certainly think about it." My non-committal answer satisfied him. He saw it as me being flattered, perhaps a little overwhelmed by the prospect of a real job. He clapped me on the shoulder and turned back to his sons, the conversation immediately shifting back to profit margins and asset liquidation. They forgot about me instantly. I sat there, invisible in plain sight, nursing my anger and polishing my plan. That night, I was back in Alara's study with Ben. The room had become my sanctuary and my war room. The glow of the monitors cast long shadows on the walls as we worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of mission. "He's underestimating the shareholders' loyalty to Chen," Ben said, pointing to a column of figures. "His offer is insulting. If we can present a viable alternative, a white knight offer, we can rally enough of them to block him." The plan we formulated was bold, precise, and utterly ruthless in its own quiet way. We wouldn't just block my father. We would build a fortress around Innovatech that he could never breach. The Gaia Legacy Endowment would execute a tender offer to purchase 51% of Innovatech's shares, a controlling stake. We would offer a price that was not just fair, but generous, a price that reflected the true potential of David Chen's technology, not its temporary, manipulated stock value. It was a rescue, not a raid. "It will cost nearly $300 million, Ben said, his voice even, but his eyes searching mine, testing my resolve. For a moment, the sheer scale of it was dizzying. I was a horticulturist. I thought in terms of soil composition and sunlight, not nine-figure financial transactions. But then I thought of David Chen's tired, hopeful face. I thought of my father's predatory glee. I looked at Alara's picture. This was what she had prepared me for. "My father taught me that you have to be willing to spend whatever it takes to win," I said, my voice steady. "The difference is, he's willing to spend it to destroy something. We're willing to spend it to build something." The next 2 weeks were a blur of clandestine activity. Ben and his team worked the financial channels with the stealth of commandos, quietly buying up small blocks of Innovatech stock on the open market, careful not to trigger any alarms. I spent my days on the phone with lawyers, drafting the tender offer, and my nights in the study, learning more about corporate governance and finance in 2 weeks than I had in a lifetime. I was exhausted, terrified, and more alive than I had ever felt. The final piece of the strategy was the timing. My father, in his hubris, had scheduled a special shareholder meeting for Finley Capital. The sole purpose of the meeting was to allow him to take a victory lap, to formally announce the successful, hostile acquisition of Innovatech Solutions to his investors and the press. He wanted a public coronation. I decided to give him a public humbling instead. Our tender offer was timed to go live and be accepted by a pre-arranged majority of Innovatech shareholders on the very morning of my father's meeting. The news would break not in a press release, but in the middle of his triumphant speech. The day before the meeting, Ben placed the final stack of documents on Alara's desk in front of me. It was the formal authorization to execute the tender offer. My signature was the only thing needed to set the entire massive plan in motion. I picked up the pen, its weight feeling immense in my hand. This was the point of no return. This was the moment I stepped out from behind the Petunias and into the boardroom. I was no longer just Rebecca Finley, the daughter, the gardener. I was the director of the Gaia Legacy Endowment. I was Alara Vance's heir. I thought of my father's condescending offer to let me landscape his corporate graveyard, and with a hand that did not tremble, I signed my name. "Set it in motion, Ben," I said. "Let's give my father a surprise." The Finley Capital shareholder meeting was held in a cavernous auditorium in a downtown skyscraper. The room was a symphony of gray and chrome, cold and imposing, designed to make human beings feel small and insignificant in the face of corporate might. It smelled of money and ambition. I found a seat in the middle of the audience, intentionally positioning myself where I would be visible, but not immediately conspicuous. I had traded my usual practical trousers and comfortable boots for a charcoal gray suit, impeccably tailored, with a silk blouse the color of a stormy sky. It was armor. My brothers saw me as they were making their way to their reserved seats in the front row. Grant did a double take, a smirk playing on his lips. He leaned over to Marcus, and I could read his silent question. "What is she doing here?" Marcus shrugged, giving me a dismissive glance. They probably thought I had finally taken our father's pathetic job offer to heart and had come to witness what real business looked like. Grant even gave me a little condescending wave, as if to a child who had wandered into the adult section. I met his gaze and gave him a small, serene smile. It seemed to confuse him, which gave me a small measure of satisfaction. I let my eyes wander over the crowd. It was a sea of dark suits and expectant faces. Analysts, journalists, major investors, all of them here to witness the coronation of Arthur Findlay. He thrived on this. The public display of dominance was as important to him as the deal itself. I felt a flutter of nerves in my stomach, a cold dread that felt like 1,000 tiny insects crawling under my skin. What if I was wrong? What if we had missed something? What if this all blew up in my face, cementing my status as the family fool for all eternity? I took a deep, centering breath, my hand instinctively going to the small, smooth stone I kept in my pocket, a stone I'd picked up from the path of the first garden Alara and I had built together. It grounded me. This wasn't just for me. It was for Alara. It was for David Chen. It was for every quiet creator who had ever been threatened by a loud destroyer. The lights dimmed and a hush fell over the room. My father walked onto the stage to a round of enthusiastic applause. He stood at the sleek, modern lectern, basking in the adoration. He looked invincible. He was in his element, a predator at the head of his pack, preparing to display his kill. He began his speech with the usual platitudes, thanking the shareholders and extolling the virtues of his executive team. His voice was smooth, confident, dripping with the self-assurance of a man who had never known a real defeat. He ran through the quarterly numbers, each figure a testament to his aggressive, take-no-prisoners philosophy. Then he transitioned to the main event. But profits, as we know, are not just about maintaining the status quo, he boomed, his voice resonating through the auditorium's perfect sound system. They are about bold, strategic growth. They are about identifying undervalued assets and unlocking their true potential for the benefit of our shareholders. He paused for dramatic effect, a showman working his audience. For the past several months, my team has been engaged in one such strategic acquisition. A technology company, Innovatech Solutions, possessed of some truly brilliant patents, but sadly lacking the leadership and financial discipline to succeed. He painted a picture of Innovatech as a mismanaged, failing enterprise that Findlay Capital was heroically stepping in to save from itself. He spoke of David Chen with a thinly veiled contempt, calling him a well-meaning but naive academic. I felt my jaw tighten. The sheer, unadulterated gall of his narrative was breathtaking. He wasn't just taking over a company, he was rewriting its history to suit his own. And so, my father declared, his chest swelling with pride, his eyes sweeping the room, it is with great pleasure that I announce that as of this morning, Findlay Capital has secured the final necessary agreements to complete our acquisition of Innovatech. Its valuable patents will be integrated into our portfolio, and its assets will be liquidated, promising a significant return for all of you. It is a testament to our vision, our strength, and our... Mr. Chairman, the voice cut through the air, clear, calm, and utterly unexpected. It was Ben Carter. He was standing near the front of the auditorium, his posture relaxed, but his presence undeniable. A ripple of confusion went through the room. All eyes swiveled from my father to Ben. My father froze, his mouth slightly agape. His face, which had been a mask of triumph, was now a canvas of pure fury. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice tight with anger at being interrupted at his moment of glory. "This is a private shareholder meeting." Ben smiled, a small, polite smile that did nothing to soften the steel in his eyes. "My name is Ben Carter, and I am the Chief Financial Officer for the Gaia Legacy Endowment, and I am also a shareholder in Innovatec, as is the endowment I represent. And on that basis, Mr. Chairman, I must inform you that you are mistaken." The murmurs in the room grew louder. I could see journalists leaning over to whisper to their colleagues. My father's face was turning a dangerous shade of red. "Mistaken? What are you talking about? My legal team confirmed the deal this morning." "Your legal team was operating on outdated information," Ben said, his voice remaining perfectly level, a rock of calm in a rising sea of chaos. "While you were preparing for this meeting, a new tender offer was presented to the Innovatec shareholders, an offer that valued their work fairly and guaranteed the company's future rather than its dissolution. I can confirm that as of 9 a.m. this morning, that offer was accepted by shareholders representing 51% of the company." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Finley Capital does not have a controlling interest in Innovatec Solutions. The Gaia Legacy Endowment does." A collective gasp went through the room. My father looked as if he had been physically struck. "The Gaia Legacy Endowment?" he sputtered, breaking into a dismissive, incredulous laugh. That's a charity, a gardening club. You plant flowers. You don't have the capital to buy a corner store, let alone a tech company." He was trying to regain control, to belittle the threat into non-existence. Ben's polite smile never wavered. "Our capital is quite sufficient, I assure you, Mr. Finley." Alara Vance was a very prudent investor. He looked directly at my father. "And as for our leadership, you seem to think we're just a bunch of well-meaning amateurs. Perhaps you should ask our new director. She's the one who authorized the acquisition." And with a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture, Ben turned his head and looked directly at me. Every single head in the room followed his gaze. A spotlight, it felt like, had swung around and pinned me to my seat. The murmuring stopped. The room fell into a profound, echoing silence. I saw my brothers, Grant and Marcus, their faces frozen in identical masks of slack-jawed disbelief. I saw the confused faces of the investors and the reporters. And then I saw my father. His eyes locked onto mine. The confusion, the anger, the arrogance, it all dissolved in an instant, replaced by a look of such profound, shattering shock that it was almost painful to witness. The color drained from his face. It was the look of a man whose entire understanding of the world had just been upended. He saw his daughter, the gardener, the charity case. I rose slowly from my seat, the tailored suit feeling less like armor now and more like my own skin. I stood tall, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my hands were steady. I met my father's gaze across the sea of stunned faces. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "Hello, Father," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was as clear and as calm as Ben's had been. "You were right about one thing. I am a gardener." I let a small, genuine smile touch my lips. "I plant things. I nurture them. I help them grow. And today, I just planted a future for Innovatec Solutions. A future that you are not a part of." The silence broke. The auditorium erupted into a cacophony of shouting voices, flashing cameras, and scraping chairs. It was pandemonium. Reporters were scrambling over seats, shouting my name, shouting my father's name. "What endowment? Who is she? Finley, is this true?" My father stood at the lectern, utterly frozen, a statue of a broken man. His face was ashen, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish pulled from the water. He looked from me to Ben and back again, his mind clearly unable to process the reality of what had just happened. Through the chaos, my brothers, Grant and Marcus, were pushing their way toward me. Their faces were a comical mixture of panic and confusion. "Becca?" Grant stammered, grabbing my arm. "Becca, what the hell was that? What did you do?" His voice was high-pitched, incredulous. He looked at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up into his eyes. I didn't say a word. I simply pulled my arm away from his grasp with a slow, deliberate motion. I gave him and Marcus one last, long look, a look that held a decade of dismissal and a moment of finality, and then I turned my back on them. Ben was already at my side. "Shall we, Director?" he asked quietly, a tiny, triumphant glint in his eye. "I believe our work here is done." We walked toward the exit, a small island of calm in the swirling vortex of chaos we had created. The shouted questions and the stunned face of my father faded behind us. Walking out of that auditorium felt like walking out of a cage I hadn't even fully realized I was in. The air outside, even the city air, thick with exhaust fumes, had never smelled so sweet or so free. My phone started buzzing before we even reached the elevator. I glanced at the screen. "Father" was flashing in capital letters. I let it ring. It rang again and again. By the time Ben and I were in the back of a town car navigating through the city, I had 17 missed calls from my father, my brothers, and even my mother. The 18th time I finally answered. "Rebecca!" My father's voice roared through the phone, a raw, wounded sound, stripped of its usual authority. "What did you do? What in God's name did you do?" I held the phone slightly away from my ear, waiting for the initial wave of fury to pass. "I did my job, Father," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Your job is planting petunias. You stole this from me, from your own family. This was my deal. I built this. You don't have the right." "You were going to destroy that company," I stated, not as an accusation, but as a fact. "You were going to gut it and sell the pieces. The Gaia Legacy Endowment exists to prevent people like you from doing things like that. It wasn't personal. It was a business decision." I used his own words, his own cold, detached language, and I could feel it strike him silent. There was a moment of stunned quiet on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The rage was gone, replaced by a bewildered, almost pleading tone I had never heard from him before. "How? The money. Where did you get that kind of money, Becca?" "Alara Vance was a very wise woman," I replied. "She taught me that true wealth isn't about what you can acquire. It's about what you can preserve and nurture." I took a breath. "The decision is final. Innovatech has a new majority partner. We will not be selling the patents. We will be funding their future." I didn't wait for his response. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to wait for his approval, his anger, or his dismissal. I ended the call. I had set my first and most important boundary. The next day, I went to Innovatech. The atmosphere was electric. The news had spread like wildfire. When I walked into the lobby with Ben, the entire company was there, crowded into the atrium. They broke into spontaneous, thunderous applause. David Chen pushed through the crowd, his face transformed. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated joy and relief. He grabbed my hands, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how or why, but you saved us." "We didn't just save you, David," I said, my voice carrying over the crowd. "We're investing in you. The Gaia Legacy Endowment believes in your vision. We're here to be your partners. We're going to give you the resources you need to change the world." A fresh wave of cheers went up. Later that day, I walked with David through the community garden. The sunflowers stood tall, their faces turned toward the sun. For the first time, my two worlds, the world of finance and power I had inherited, and the world of growth and cultivation I had chosen, were not in conflict. They had merged right here in this small patch of green, thriving against all odds. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a rightness that was as deep and nourishing as rich soil. A year can change everything. In the 12 months that followed the showdown at the Finley Capital shareholder meeting, Innovatech, backed by the full financial and strategic power of the Gaia Legacy Endowment, didn't just survive, it flourished. David Chen's battery technology, properly funded and scaled, went into production. It was hailed by the tech and environmental communities as a monumental breakthrough. We signed major contracts with 3 countries to build grid-scale energy storage facilities. David, no longer a struggling idealist, became a celebrated innovator, and he never once lost the humility and integrity that had made him a target in the first place. He kept every single one of his employees and even expanded his workforce by 50%. My own life transformed as well. The story of the gardener who outmaneuvered the legendary corporate raider Arthur Finley became something of a legend in the business world. I was featured in magazines, not as a socialite or a curiosity, but as a new kind of power player. I was invited to speak at conferences on impact investing and sustainable capitalism. I was no longer Dr. Rebecca Finley, the daughter. I was Director Finley, a force to be reckoned with. The name my family had used as a gentle mockery became a title of respect in the world at large. The dynamic with my family shifted into a new, strange, and uncomfortable landscape. The condescension was gone, vaporized in the heat of my public triumph. It was replaced by a wary, almost fearful curiosity. They treated me like a foreign dignitary they were desperate not to offend. I was invited to another Sunday dinner, a year to the day after the one where they had mocked Innovatech's vegetable patch. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. My father tried to talk to me about the markets, about geopolitical risk, about a new fund he was trying to launch. He was attempting to speak to me as an equal, a peer, but it was clumsy, awkward. His questions were transparently aimed at gauging the depth of the endowment's resources, at trying to understand the power he was now facing. He was looking at me, but he was seeing a balance sheet. He hadn't changed. He had just reevaluated my asset value. My brothers were even more lost. They were quiet, deferential. Grant even tried to compliment me on the Innovatech deal. That was really something, Becca. Nobody saw that coming. It was brilliant. The praise felt hollow, like a counterfeit coin. It wasn't an apology for years of mockery. It was an admission of defeat from a lesser predator. The most surprising moment came from my mother. As I was leaving, she pulled me aside in the grand foyer. Her eyes were filled with a complex mix of pride and regret. "I'm so proud of you, Rebecca," she whispered, and for the first time I felt she meant it. But then she added, "Your father, he's just not used to being challenged. Be patient with him." Even in her pride, she was still his defender, the eternal smoother over. I realized then that while I could command their respect, I could never truly command their understanding. They were who they were. The difference was it no longer mattered to me. I no longer needed them to see me. I could finally see myself. Later that week, I was visiting the therapeutic garden we had built at the Children's Hospital. I sat on a bench watching a little girl in a wheelchair gently touch the soft, fuzzy leaves of a lamb's ear plant, a look of quiet wonder on her face. This was real value. This was the return on investment that could never be quantified on a spreadsheet. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. For so long, I had believed that strength was what my father had, loud, aggressive, destructive power. I thought my own quiet, nurturing nature was a weakness, a failing. I was wrong. Ilara had known it all along. Being underestimated, being dismissed as just the gardener, had been my greatest advantage. It allowed me to grow in the shadows, to build my root system deep and wide, unseen, until I was ready to bloom in the most unexpected of places. My family's narrow definition of worth was the cage, and my passion for gardening was the key that set me free. It took a corporate battle and a family showdown for me to fully embrace my own power, but I hope my story can help you find yours a little sooner. The world will often try to put you in a box, to label you and limit your potential based on its own narrow vision. But your worth is not determined by anyone else's approval, especially not from those who refuse to see you for who you truly are. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever had to fight to prove your worth to the people who should have known it all along? I would be honored if you shared your story in the comments below. Let's create a community of support for everyone who is quietly growing, getting ready for their moment to bloom. Don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and please subscribe for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Thank you so much for joining me today and for listening to my story. Remember, family is defined by love and respect, not just by blood. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is grow, especially when everyone around you expects you to wither.